Hello, everybody, and welcome again to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together over 80 national associations of Christian doctors and dentists around the world, representing some 60,000 professionals and professionals in training. And today on ICMDA webinars, we have Dr. Calum Miller back, talking to us on the subject of reducing abortion rates. So let's get started. It's great to have Dr. Calum Miller back. Hi, Calum. Great to see you. Where are you at the moment? You're back in the UK from your travels?
I'm in London at the moment, which is quite rare, but it is where I live. So yeah, it's nice to be back for Christmas.
That's great. So on reducing abortion rates, and the thing is that even among pro-life people, there's often debate about what really stops abortions from happening. Is it best, on the one hand, to look for legislative solutions and to pass laws protecting unborn children and women from abortion directly? Or is it better to do sex education and family planning? Or is it a combination of both? What about welfare to provide practically for women in difficult financial situations with unplanned pregnancies? It's a really vexed question. And in this webinar, Dr. Miller is going to summarize the empirical evidence, look at the literature on what is best done in order to save babies' lives and to support pregnant women. Dr. Calum Miller is no stranger to ICMDA webinars. He's a medical doctor based in the UK and a research associate at the University of Oxford. He speaks regularly on mainstream media and to parliamentarians around the world about how to protect both women and children from abortion. He holds a master's degree also in biblical studies, and he's very much engaged in international pro-life advocacy and also very keen to help others. So if you are wanting assistance or networking or some advice or encouragement, then he is available to do that. More on that later. So Calum, over to you, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say and discussing it. Thanks.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back speaking with you. And yeah, it's always lovely to be speaking to people with ICMDA. I've been working with the CMDF in Indonesia, with the CMF in the UK, with the CMDF growing in the Philippines recently. So all over, it's wonderful to see what's going on. I'm particularly excited about this topic because it's actually something that I'm editing a book volume on over the next couple of years. Because really, as Peter says, there is so much disagreement about what actually is it that makes a difference. Is it contraception or welfare or sex education or pro-life laws? And so what I want to try and do in this lecture is really just give the empirical evidence so that we can actually make an evidence-based decision on that. And as we will see, the evidence is quite nuanced. It's not just a case of do this and not this. It really depends how you do it. So I hope that will become clear as we go through. So here's part of the issue. Some people claim that pro-life policies don't work. If you make abortion illegal or you restrict it, people will still get abortions anyway. By contrast, they say that things that maybe more progressive parties or activists propose, like contraception or sex education or welfare, do prevent abortions. And therefore, if you want to prevent abortions, you should be a progressive rather than be pro-life in terms of your politics. So let's see what the empirical evidence has to show about this. I'll go through each of those in turn. So we'll speak about welfare, then we'll speak about sex education, then we'll speak for quite a while about contraception, and then finally at the end, we'll look at the question of whether pro-life laws themselves work. So what about welfare? Well, I first want to offer some cautions or limitations about welfare. Why is it that financial support for women with difficult pregnancies may not work as well as we might expect? Well, one of the reasons for this is that actually most abortions do not take place for financial reasons. Most abortions aren't because a woman says, I don't have enough money. Now, in some countries, it is a slight majority of women who say this, but only in some countries. And most of those women say that they have many reasons for not wanting a baby. So even if you solved her financial difficulty, she would still want an abortion for some other reasons. So finances are usually one of many reasons, and solving the financial difficulties won't be sufficient for a woman to continue a pregnancy. So there's a paper, for example, that was published a couple of decades ago now, but specifically asked women having abortions, do you want advice on financial support available? Most of them said no. And even those who said, yes, I would like the information, only a small proportion would have actually changed their minds about the abortion if they were given the financial support. We know likewise that in many parts of the world that are very, very wealthy, the abortion rates are very, very high. And by contrast, in many parts of the world that have significantly less wealth and economic growth, abortion rates are significantly lower in many cases. And actually, whether a country has a huge amount of wealth or only very little amount of wealth, the number of women saying that they are having abortions because they have not enough money is actually quite similar. So it doesn't seem to make a difference whether a country has a lot of money or not very much money. People will say that they have abortions for these reasons, regardless of how much money there is available. Now, there's particularly interesting evidence available from within Europe, because different European countries have very different policies on welfare support, financial support for families, and maternity leave for mothers. So what I actually did was I collected the top 10 countries with the most maternity leave and the top 10 countries with the top family policies in Europe. And what you actually find when you look at those statistics is that the countries with by far the most maternity leave and the most support for families actually have high abortion rates. They actually have higher abortion rates than average for Europe. Now, there are other factors that come into this, so it's a bit complicated, but it shows that the solution is not simply give people more money or more maternity leave and they will have their baby. Things are much more complicated than that. So again, that's quite interesting data. One possible exception to that is that Hungary, although it had a very high abortion rate in the past, Hungary's abortion rate has now come down a huge amount in the last 10 to 20 years because it has combined very generous family policies and maternity leave policies and welfare policies with encouragement to have a baby and discouragement away from abortion. And I'll explain that a little bit in a moment. Now, in the United States, there's been really concrete, kind of sophisticated research on this. So this is from a political scientist with some econometric research. Laura Hussey is a political scientist in the US, and what she suggested was that when welfare reform occurred in the United States, it actually didn't have much impact on the abortion rate. But what she then did was she compared the different states in the United States to figure out which of them have low abortion rates and how does that relate to their welfare policy. Well, this is perhaps the key finding. She found that when a state in the United States of America was pro-choice in its policy, it supported abortion, it tried its best to keep abortion legal, and so on, increasing welfare in those states increased the abortion rate for quite complicated reasons. So welfare in a pro-choice setting can actually be counterproductive in terms of saving lives from abortion. By contrast, when you look at a pro-life state in America, states that try their best to restrict abortion, that try to protect the unborn child, that try to promote family and motherhood, welfare in those states did have an impact and it really did save lives. So welfare is a very, very complicated thing, and its impact on abortion really depends on the political environment. In pro-choice environments, it seems to make the problem worse, but in pro-life environments, it does make an impact positively. So what this means, therefore, in terms of the takeaway, is that when it's combined with a pro-life law and pro-life culture, welfare can help. It certainly can. And that can be government welfare, or it can be private, support through pregnancy resource centers, through maternity homes, and all sorts of private agencies that are available as well. So welfare can help But the key thing here is that the law and the culture have to be pro-life in order for welfare to help. So the law is the most central, important thing, and welfare only improves that if it's there in the first place. If the law is pro-choice, welfare doesn't seem to help at all. Now, again, there are different kinds of welfare. Some of them help more than others. So we know that many reasons for abortion are to do with a woman's education and her career. It's not just a simple matter of, I need an urgent cash kind of deposit in the short term. It's that if I have this baby, it's going to disrupt my long-term education and my long-term career and my long-term earnings. It's not that I don't have enough money right now, because I potentially do have enough money. I just am scared that in the long run, my education and career will suffer. So those are the sorts of things that need to be addressed with good welfare policy, with good maternity policies, helping women to complete their education and to succeed in their career at the same time as having a baby. We know that things like maternity leave, flexible working hours, the ability to work from home are all important components of that. Now, you'll notice that much of what I've said has been in the West, and I haven't looked much at the evidence in the developing world. That is because there isn't much evidence of good quality in the developing world on this question. And so we do need better evidence in the developing world. But even so, we can still learn from the experiences of Europe and of the United States. So then secondly, we'll say a little bit about sex education and contraception. Now, the best way to think about this is that you cannot assume in advance whether sex education and contraception will decrease the abortion rate. And the reason is because both of these have multiple effects on the abortion rate. On the one hand, of course, both of them can reduce the risk of a pregnancy in a given act of sexual intercourse. So we know that if you use contraception in a given act of sexual intercourse, your chance of pregnancy is much, much lower. And if you give someone sex education to tell them to use that contraception, there is a small chance that they will do so. On the other hand, both of these can increase sexual behavior, and particularly risky sexual behavior. Because if you tell people that there is such a thing as safe sex, that as long as they use contraception, they will be fine, this encourages people to have sex with multiple partners, to have sex before marriage, to have sex with people that they don't intend to have a child with. And what that means is that you get an increase in unwanted pregnancies because you have a lot more sex and you have a lot more relationships that are not ready for a child. So what this means is that sex education and contraception can decrease unwanted pregnancies, but they can also increase them. And so we cannot assume in advance their impact. We have to look at the empirical evidence to see whether they overall decrease it or increase unwanted pregnancies, or they have no impact because both of these forces cancel each other out. So let's look at some of the evidence. Firstly, with sex education, we know that there are many different kinds of sex education, so they're not all the same. And this is why this topic is so nuanced. Let's talk firstly about comprehensive sex education, which is a more formal term for a particular kind of sex education that is promoted by the UN, the WHO, and various other international institutions and NGOs. Now, we know what this includes because there are syllabuses, there are curricula, there are standards published for comprehensive sex education. And if you just look at these resources, it is very clear that they are primarily about encouraging the sexualization of children. In some cases, I would say they go as far as grooming children. Now, here is just an example. This is from the WHO's Sex Education Standards for Europe. And this is the age for 0 to 4-year-olds. It says that 0 to 4-year-olds should be given information about various different things, including at the bottom, enjoyment and pleasure when touching one's own body, early childhood masturbation, and so on. It talks about many different things. Here's another example from the same standards. This is for 9 to 12-year-olds. So these are children, absolutely children. They should be given information at 9 years old about their first sexual experience, about gender orientation, about sexual behavior, about masturbation and orgasm. And not only should they be given information, but on the right-hand side, it says they should be given the skills to make a conscious decision to have sexual experiences or not. Now, this is not just telling them how to say no, because that is already covered directly beneath. They already say children should be taught to refuse unwanted sexual experiences. This is saying that at 9 years old, they should be given the skills to make a conscious decision to have sexual experiences or not. And this is for 9-year-old children. Now, it's pretty clear that this is not going to help the problem of unwanted pregnancies. It is going to encourage children to have sex, and children do not use contraception well. They shouldn't be using it at all because they shouldn't be having sex, but they don't use it well if they do end up having sex. So as we will see, there is no good evidence, in fact, that this sort of education works, and it probably makes the problem worse for all of these reasons. This is a study which really looks through all of the studies on comprehensive sex education, and it shows pretty conclusively that this sort of education does not reduce unwanted pregnancies. And in fact, it might well make the problem worse. On the other hand, there is such a thing as good sex education or relationships education. This is education which puts relationships at the center rather than sex, because sex is just a part of relationship. It is not the end goal. This sort of education encourages responsibility, respect, self-esteem, confidence, and understanding one's own identity in an authentic way that gives them confidence that they are created fearfully and wonderfully made. There is some evidence that this helps reduce unwanted pregnancies and reduce abortions, but we do need better evidence on it. So here are just some of the studies which have done this. Most of you will know about the Cochrane Library. It's a database of systematic reviews. So it's pretty much the gold standard when it comes to looking at interventions and whether they work. There are 2 Cochrane reviews on sex education, and they are both looking at randomized controlled trials. So this is really the best quality evidence that you can get. Well, one of these looked at sex education, and it found that in pretty much all the studies, it had no impact on overall pregnancy rates among young people. But in fact, there was one randomized trial in this review which did show a massive decrease in pregnancies. In fact, it reduced the pregnancy rate by 80%. And if you look on the bottom right, this is the curriculum. It was not comprehensive sex education. It was an abstinence program that talked about the biology, that talked about fertility awareness, that talked about the manipulation of sexuality in the media. It talked about marriage and the family, the beginning of life, the value of human life, and so on. This was the intervention which showed an enormous reduction in pregnancies in the randomized controlled trial. Likewise, the second Cochrane database review from the Cochrane Library again showed that there was basically no impact of sex education. It did show that some of the interventions worked, but these were about general education, not about sex education. So, of course, general education gives people confidence. It gives people the ability to achieve things by themselves without relying on another person who might want to get them pregnant, and so on. So general education might well work, but sex education, at least the radical sexualization kind, does not work at all. And then finally, just a more recent article from a couple of years ago in the Health Economics Journal. What it found was that actually mandates that required children to go through sex education were actually associated with an increase in teen pregnancies and abortions. And actually this effect was mitigated if the parents were allowed to take their child out of the program. So it really showed that this sort of sex education makes the problem worse, but if you allow parents to take their children out of it, the problem is not as bad. So all in all, to say, The evidence for sex education, reducing unwanted pregnancies and reducing abortions, is very, very poor. It's almost non-existent when you look at good quality studies. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions tend to be either general education, or they are about giving people good relationships education, focusing on abstinence, self-respect, marriage, family, and the value of human life. So then I want to come to talking about contraception. There's a huge amount to say about this, and you will notice that I skip through quite a lot of it because we only have limited time. Now, we know that contraception, of course, in any given instance, will make pregnancy less likely. That's completely uncontroversial. If you're going to have sex, using contraception will make it less likely that you get pregnant. But what we're interested in here is policies promoting contraception on a large scale. And that has many different impacts because it also changes the sexual behavior. Now, this is summarized by a recent review article which says that the risk of unplanned pregnancies is determined by three main factors: the proportion of sexually active women, the proportion of women using any contraceptive method, and the efficacy of the contraceptive used. So, of course, if more women use contraception, then they will personally be less likely to get pregnant. But by promoting contraception, you increase the number of sexually active women, and therefore it can also increase unwanted pregnancies. So firstly, we know that actually this idea of contraception promotion is not likely to have a huge impact, partly because contraception is already very widely available to people who actually want it. This is just a series of studies from around the world. In Europe, 90% of women who want to avoid pregnancy already use modern contraception. Even in the developing world, unmet need for contraception, that is, women who don't want to have a pregnancy but are having sex, that unmet need is only about 13% in the developing world. So the large majority of women who don't want to have a baby and who are sexually active in the developing world are already using contraception. But actually, when you look at the evidence, the reason for this is even more interesting, because there have been a couple of review articles which have shown that out of that 13%, most of those women are not using contraception because of side effects, because they don't want to use contraception, because they are ambivalent about pregnancy, because they have made a decision with their partner to try for a baby, because they are using traditional forms of contraception, or because they are breastfeeding. There are many, many reasons that women do not have contraception other than a lack of access. In fact, only about 5% of unmet need for contraception globally is because of lack of access. So what this means is that the proportion of women in developing countries that lack access to contraception is estimated to be about 1 to 2%. It is a tiny, tiny percentage, and it is not going to make a huge difference to abortion rates. Now, there's much more to say about that. And if some of you in other parts of the world have different experiences, I'd of course be very grateful to hear them. But this is what the review evidence seems to show at the moment. We know that many, as I said, many women don't want to use contraception. We also know that contraception fails very often. We know that the condom failure rate is about 18% every year, which means that if someone only uses condoms over 5 years, they are actually more likely than not to get pregnant. So contraception is not effective over the long term. Likewise, using a contraceptive pill is only about 62% effective over 5 years. Over 5 years, nearly half of women on the pill will get pregnant. So we know that contraception fails, and therefore it cannot be the main solution to abortion. And the contraception failure rate is higher in certain countries. As I said, we know that contraception causes people to have a lot more sex and causes them to have risky sex in particular. And here is just a load of evidence for that, which I don't have time to go into in detail. So then let's look very briefly at the empirical evidence on this, just to see whether these theoretical considerations actually bear out in studies that promote contraception. Well, here is a simple example, the example of emergency contraception that is used after sex has taken place. There is actually unanimous consensus from everyone on this topic that interventions promoting emergency contraception do not decrease pregnancy rates. There have been multiple systematic reviews, including a Cochrane review, that absolutely decisively show that promoting emergency contraception has not reduced unintended pregnancies. The evidence on that is pretty much uncontroversial. No one in this literature thinks that promoting emergency contraception actually works on a large scale, which is surprising, but it is the case. Likewise, for more general contraception promotion interventions, again, there is a Cochrane review on this, which looks specifically at contraceptive promoting interventions. And what it found is that when you look at randomized controlled trials for adolescents who received contraceptive promoting interventions, there was little or no difference in the risk of unintended first pregnancy. As I said, there's a lot more evidence on this, and I could go through all of that in detail. The slides are just showing that that's true, but we don't have time today. But I do want to highlight just the general trends in abortion rates as they connect with contraception use. So there have actually been a series of studies that look at what happens in a country as the contraception prevalence increases. What those studies have generally found is that in most countries, as contraception prevalence increases, the abortion rate also increases for various reasons that we can go into. There are a few exceptions. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, under communism, abortion was already being used as birth control. Now, if people are having 5 abortions throughout their life, as was quite typical in Romania under communism, for example, adding contraception in those situations where people are already using abortion as birth control, contraception clearly does reduce the abortion rate. If people are already having a lot of sex when they don't want a baby and the sexual revolution has occurred, and then you introduce contraception, it probably does reduce the abortion rate. But if you are working in a conservative country where people's sexual behavior depends on the law about contraception and the law about abortion, then contraception only has the effect of increasing risky sexual behavior and therefore making the problem worse. As I said, there's loads more evidence to talk about there. We can only cover it in a bit of detail. But just to show that this is mainstream empirical science, most of these authors are pro-choice, but they are saying that, in fact, the relationship between contraception and abortion is much more complicated than we might think. Now, there is perhaps one exception to this, which is long-acting reversible contraception. As most of us know, this is much more effective at preventing a pregnancy than most other forms of contraception. However, even with long-acting reversible contraception, there are some things to take into account. The first to take into account is that at least copper coils are very likely to work after fertilization. We know with virtual certainty that copper coils work after fertilization, and therefore they cannot be a good solution to abortion because they actually cause very early abortions. With Mirena coils and hormonal IUDs, the evidence is a bit more mixed, and we don't have time to go into that, but at least it's not as clear-cut as for copper coils. Even with Mirena coils, though, for example, and depot injections and implants, we know that there are still very, very high abortion rates in countries that have easily available long-acting reversible contraception. This is because most women do not want long-acting reversible contraception, and it's because it's not used very often because women simply don't want it. So in countries like France, where they have very high LARC rates, in Cuba, where they had very high LARC rates, in East and South Asia, where they had very high LARC rates and even sterilization rates, the abortion rates are still very, very high. And the same is true in Scandinavia and other places. There are actually, again, not many good studies, if any, showing that long-acting reversible contraception promotion decreases the abortion rate. So here are just a couple of summaries from leading pro-choice researchers and authors. Sam Rowlands, a leading researcher, says, "It is never likely that abortion will be avoided by higher uptake of and compliance with contraception. Women in modern societies use abortion as an adjunct to contraception. When they do not use contraception with a new or pre-existing partner, or when the method fails. Human behavior being what it is, there will always be non-use of contraception, mishaps when using contraception, and requests for abortion." Here's another example from Anne Furedi. Anne Furedi was the CEO of the UK's largest abortion provider. She said this: "With birth control, policymakers, donors, international aid agencies, and sometimes the medical profession collude in the blatant falsehood. Contraception can prevent abortion. In truth, contraception does not and cannot prevent abortion. The experience of Europe shows this to be the case." And this is, as I said, the CEO, the former CEO of the UK's largest abortion provider. And she's actually written a whole book chapter on this topic. So then finally, I just want to come to some of the evidence about pro-life laws. These are laws that directly prohibit or restrict abortion. Now, we know that these have multiple effects. They create policy barriers so that it is not legal to get abortions. They reduce the number of abortion providers because providers can't make enough money because they cannot operate legally and so on. And they also change community attitudes. If the law says that abortion is the killing of a human and should not be done, people are more pro-life as a result, and therefore they are less likely to have an abortion. So there are various mechanisms by which pro-life laws do reduce the abortion rate. But here is a good illustration of what I've just said about contraception as well. This is a graph of Republican and Democrat states in America. And it looks at those states by both their contraceptive prevalence and by their abortion rate. And although it's a bit complex, what it basically shows is that the abortion rate doesn't seem to have much correlation with contraceptive prevalence. Most states have very different abortion rates. Most states have pretty high contraceptive prevalence, and there doesn't seem to be much connection between the two. What there is a big difference, however, is, let me say that again. Where we do see a big difference in abortion rate is between the Republican and the Democrat states. The Republican states, those in red, are clearly much, much lower in abortion rates than the Democrat states, because in Republican states, they have pro-life laws and pro-life cultures. And so what we see is that by far the bigger determinant of the abortion rate is not contraceptive prevalence, but is actually the pro-life laws and the pro-life culture. Now, again, there's a huge amount of evidence on this. It is actually completely decisively proven that pro-life laws do reduce the abortion rate. Here's just one example. We know that people who support abortion constantly talk about barriers to accessing abortion, and they talk about what will happen when all these children are born as a result of banning abortion. Now, when people ask that question, they are already admitting that if you ban abortion, not everyone will get an abortion. They are already admitting that some children will be born as a result. So everyone agrees, when they really think about it, that pro-life laws do prevent abortions. In fact, this was a paper published by one of the leading pro-abortion researchers in the world. She's very well known. She is probably one of the top few pro-abortion researchers in the entire world. She published an article explicitly addressed to her fellow pro-choice researchers and activists. And the title was, "Stop Saying That Making Abortion Illegal Won't Stop People from Having Them." The subtitle was, "Criminalizing abortion or making it less accessible means that some women carry unwanted pregnancies to term." Now, she was making a different implication from this. She was saying that these women will have babies and their lives will be worse as a result. But what she is absolutely clear on is that when abortion is not available, many women will keep the baby instead. In fact, there are about 24 studies which show specifically this. There are about 24 studies, maybe many more, where women have been refused abortions. They cannot get an abortion. And these studies pretty much universally show that about 50 to 80% of women who are denied an abortion will go on to have the child. So what this means is that pro-life laws make a huge impact on the abortion rate. They prevent probably at least half and maybe as many as 80% of abortions. And as I said, there are about 24 or more studies on this. Likewise, there are studies where women literally say from their own mouths that if abortion were not legal, they would keep the baby instead. If we really trust women that they are telling the truth, that they do not just lie, we have to believe them when they say, the law made a difference to my decision. Now, there are many, many more examples of evidence on this. The evidence is absolutely conclusive. But I do want to say just one thing about a potential challenge to this. And this will be the very end of the presentation before we have some time for Q&A. There is one argument that people use to show that banning abortion does not make a difference. They say that abortion rates in pro-life countries and abortion rates in pro-abortion countries are the same. And therefore, the law does not make a difference. Well, there are at least 3 really major problems with this argument. The first is that in order to make this argument, you have to estimate the number of illegal abortions in pro-life countries. But we know that the method done to do that, the abortion incidence complications method, is wildly unreliable. In fact, it has been proven decisively to massively inflate the number of abortions. So what these studies show is that the abortion rate in pro-life countries is very high. And that is because they have inflated the results because of various methodological problems. And that has been proven beyond all doubt. We know that these estimates are not reliable. They are massively over-exaggerated. The second problem with that is that we know, even if we believe the results of these studies, that the abortion rate per pregnancy is much lower in pro-life countries. So even these researchers which make this argument admit that when you look at the abortion rate per pregnancy, the abortion rate is much, much lower in pro-life countries. But then finally, perhaps the most obvious and devastating problem with this argument is that this argument does not take into account confounding factors. We know that if women have more pregnancies, there will be more abortions. We know that if women have less wealth, there will be more abortions. And so what these researchers are comparing are countries that are not alike in every other respect. That is to say, they are committing a very basic correlation causation fallacy. This fallacy has been well illustrated with other examples. There is a very good correlation between the sale of ice cream and the number of shark attacks in coastal countries. But this is not because ice cream sales cause shark attacks or because shark attacks cause people to buy ice cream. It is because there is a common factor which causes both of them. The same principle is true here, that there are other factors, confounding factors, which affect the abortion rate other than just whether abortion is legal. And this argument does not look at any confounding factors at all. It is the most basic, rudimentary statistical mistake that you could make. It is something you learn about in high school, but this argument makes this mistake. And there is no real redemption for the argument as a result. So this argument is a bad argument. It has bad data, it has bad misrepresentation of the results, and it is simple bad methodology and bad use of statistics. There is no redeeming element to this argument whatsoever. So I'm very grateful for you taking the time to listen to all of this. I know there's a lot of information already. There is 10 times that information if I were to go through everything in that PowerPoint. But I hope what I've shown is that we do have very, very good empirical evidence. We have absolutely decisive empirical evidence that pro-life laws do work. And in fact, they are the most important thing for reducing abortions. We know that welfare and helping women keep their babies does help in a pro-life context, but it probably doesn't help in a pro-choice context. So the law and the culture are still central. We know that contraception can help if you are in a communist country that has had a sexual revolution and that is already using abortion as birth control. But in a conservative country, where people do adapt their sexual behavior according to the law, contraception probably doesn't work very well, if at all. We know that sex education does work if it is about respect, responsibility, self-esteem, abstinence, and the value of human life. But it doesn't work if it is about the sexualization of children and encouraging them to have sex at an early age. So on all of these other issues, the evidence is really nuanced. It's not a simple yes or no. It's much more complicated than that. But I hope this lecture has given you a better understanding of how to look at that evidence and where those nuances are. So I'm grateful for your patience, and I'd love to have some time for some questions now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Calum. We've been listening to Calum Miller speaking on reducing abortion rate. So, Calum, questions are rolling in. Rod McRory is here saying, is it a fair conclusion to say that abstinence-based sex education is one of the few evidence-based interventions that reduces abortion demand apart from pro-life laws? And should we be promoting this more rigorously in secular societies?
Yeah, thank you. Let me just say before I forget that if you don't get the chance to ask your question, or if we don't get the chance to answer it, please do feel free to email me or get me on Twitter or Facebook, and I do my best to answer that way. But to answer this first question, I think it is a fair conclusion to say that abstinence education works. Again, even then, it probably depends on the kind. Now, one of the challenges to the pro-life side and to Christians is to come up with good measurement tools to check whether our education is working. It's actually surprisingly common that we have good teaching that teaches the right material, but we don't have a good understanding of how are students responding to that, and is it making a difference? So it's really important that when we do deliver this education, we do our very best to get feedback from the students, and ideally, if we can, to follow them up long term. So some abstinence education does work. Some abstinence education, because there is so much of it around the world, probably doesn't work very well. That's just the reality, is that if it's done really well, it will work. If it's not done very well, it probably won't work. But that's why we need to share ideas, to collaborate. It's why we need to get feedback from students, and ideally to follow them up long term and do more studies, and really why we need to share best practices. So I am hoping that we can share best practices and that we can get a better understanding of what is the very best abstinence education. But it is fair to say that some good quality abstinence education definitely does work and can be promoted well. Of course, abstinence education sounds bad in a secular society. What might be a better way of framing it is delay of sexual debut or delay of sexual onset. We're not saying never have sex. We're saying wait to have sex until you are ready to have a child in a stable, long-term, committed relationship for life, which of course we call marriage. And therefore, this is the best way to do it, perhaps, is to say we are pro-sex. We think sex is a wonderful thing and it makes new life. And that is precisely why it's so important to get right and not to abuse and to wait for it.
Thanks. Calum, it's often said that one of the main factors determining whether a woman chooses an abortion or not is the attitude of her male partner, whether he's supporting it or urging her to have an abortion. Jennifer Guire's asking here, could you share your thoughts about the role of men and fathers in reducing abortion, and particularly what evidence your aware of in the literature about that question?
Thank you. Yes, it's a good question. And certainly men and fathers have a huge role to play. Anecdotally, we know it's not even just men. We know that so many women have abortions, and they say, if they're at a pregnancy resource center, for example, you are the first person who has told me that I can do this. And so many women just need to be told that they can do it, that they are strong enough, and that they have people behind them. And of course, the first person that should be there behind them is the father of the baby. So they do have a hugely important role to play. In terms of quantifying that, there are a number of studies. The two best studies that I found covering the entire world in terms of reasons for abortion are by Bancoli and by Che. Again, I can send those references to you by email, but those are studies which look at the reasons for abortions in many different countries around the world. And it will have a section that says partner-related reasons. Sometimes that's the man pressuring the woman to have an abortion. Sometimes it's the man being a deadbeat father and just abandoning the woman. Sometimes it's that the woman has had sex with a man that she doesn't really know or want to have a baby with. So the reasons are quite different, but the man has an important role in many different reasons. The final thing I'll say on that is that CareNet, which is a pregnancy resource center network in the United States, has actually recently come out with a study specifically on the role of fathers in abortion. And so I'd encourage you to go and look at CareNet's study as well. Thank you for that question.
Thanks. Margaret Eames, who's an epidemiologist who's published in this whole area of abortion prevention and the link between various factors and abortion. She writes, in the UK, long-acting reversible contraception, LARC, is funded by public health amongst teenagers, especially in deprived populations. How can we help empower teenagers to make smarter choices to choose abstinence?
It's a tricky question, especially in such a kind of so-called progressive, liberal, kind of sexualized society as the UK. I mean, it's even got to the point in the UK where our own government, which is very pro-sex revolution, even they have realized the harms of pornography among children, sexual activity among children, and the problems with sexting and all sorts of things at schools. So we are really a country to learn from because we have made such a huge mistake. And the honest truth is that it is very difficult to help young people make better choices when they have so much sex being pushed into them from every angle from a very young age. I went to a Christian school. I grew up in a church-going house. I first saw pornography when I was 11. That was like not even particularly early by average. So it's really, really difficult. I don't know exactly what the best evidence is on young people. As I said, this sex education program in one of the randomized controlled trials did have a big impact on pregnancies. I would say that is a great precedent to have, but the study is quite old and probably isn't as relevant for a society 20 years later that has much better internet access, has phones and smartphones and everything. So there will be good abstinence education. This is important. The role of parents is important in teaching their kids about sex. That's because if they don't learn about it from their parents, they will learn about it from TikTok. So parents have to be teaching their children about this and encouraging them to say no, encouraging them what sex is for, and so on. So ultimately, I would say that good abstinence education and support networks, whether through church or on the internet or otherwise, are very important. But we do actually need better research on which abstinence education works. What are the messages that really work well? What are the activities that really work well? And if we had better research on that, we could really make a big difference, I think. So if anyone's interested in that research, please do let me know, and I'd love to help get it going.
Now, your slide on US states was quite interesting, where you say that contraception rates are similar in both Democrat and Republican states, but Democrat states have a lot more abortions, and you suggested that that was because they have more liberal abortion laws. Now, Democrats, I'm sure, will come back to you and say, no, the reason women in Democrat states have high number of abortions is because those states are generally much poorer. So there's a whole a much greater number of people without access to choice. How would you counter that? What does the evidence say?
Yeah, good question. I should say one of the other potential confounding factors in that is rural and urban living. We know that in the countryside, it's much easier to have a child. In the city, it's much more expensive and costly to have a child. I would say that that's probably the bigger confounding factor, because in terms of economics, I think it would be fair to say that the Republican states, on average, are poorer. If you think about states like Mississippi, Alabama, those are some of the poorest states in the country. There are very wealthy states like California and New York, which are extremely Democrat, and all of New England. So I wouldn't be able to say for sure to disagree with you on that, but I think Republican states are poorer. But it would be true to say that there are other confounding factors, and we should do the analysis to look at those as well. But when you look at the difference in abortion rates, it seems to me very unlikely you can explain it just with urban living or with economics. I think it's very clear that pretty much without exception, the Republican states have far, far lower abortion rates than the Democrat ones. And I think it would be difficult to explain that just with country versus urban population alone, because there's not a huge difference between states on that.
Now, you talked about the pro-life laws having an effect, but you didn't really have time to unpack what kind of pro-life laws. There are laws that mandate ultrasounds or counsel or opportunity to have counseling, or which lower upper limits or restrict abortion on certain grounds. Any more on the kind of pro-life laws that are most effective in reducing abortion rates? And tied in with that question, Calum, I wonder if you could give us any examples of countries which have moved either from a pro-life law situation to more liberalization, or alternatively from a more liberal situation to a pro-life law situation, and have shown changes in abortion rates one way or the other that would back up what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you. So absolutely, there are good examples of that. We know that in Poland, they prohibited abortion in the early 1990s. Prior to that point, they had about 100,000 abortions every year. And it was estimated even by Planned Parenthood people about 6 years later that there were only 40 to 50,000 abortions. Now, this is probably an overestimate because Planned Parenthood have a vested interest in saying that there are lots of abortions going on anyway, so you might as well legalize it. Even they kind of admitted that the abortion rate had halved in Poland after it was banned. Likewise, we have many more examples of countries legalizing abortion. In the UK, it was estimated that there were maybe 10,000 illegal abortions until legalization, and there are now 200,000 a year. There are many, many more examples. Ethiopia is another good example from an African context. It was there are now 300,000 legal abortions in Ethiopia every year. And before it was legal, there were hardly any. So that's 300,000 new legal abortions. But when researchers looked at the number of illegal abortions, and they estimated those, they found that there was also an increase in illegal abortions after abortion was legalized. It's very counterintuitive, but what they basically found was that there was an increase in illegal abortions and 300,000 more legal abortions. So we have very, very good evidence that when you legalize abortion, the abortion rate goes up. I'm very sorry for the first part of your question. Oh, sorry, about the different
in terms of the kind of pro-life law that's most effective, given the different approaches.
Yeah, so the best thing to do is, of course, protect all children from the moment of conception and prevent them from being aborted legally. That won't get rid of all abortions, but it will get rid of about 50 to 80% of abortions. We know that cutting public funding for abortion reduces the abortion rate by about 30%. So that actually makes a huge difference. You can save thousands and thousands of lives just by making the woman pay for it themselves, rather than having the state pay for it themselves. By contrast, there are other things which don't have as big an impact, perhaps surprisingly. So ultrasound would be an example. The evidence about mandatory ultrasounds before an abortion actually suggests that it does reduce the abortion rate by a small amount, but not by a very large amount. Of course, it's still worth doing because it saves lives. But some of the statistics pro-life people throw around, like most women who have an ultrasound don't have an abortion, if I can put it this way, it's not really true. Most women who have abortions, an ultrasound alone would not change their minds, according to the best evidence that we have, but it does change some of their minds. So all of these things are worth doing. And there are many other laws that you could do as well, especially giving women support, giving them access to pregnancy resource centers, but some of them have a much bigger impact than others.
Thanks. And just one final question. We're not going to get through all these, but Dan O'Neill is saying, lots of Christian faith-based organizations are prioritizing family planning as a prime strategy for health promotion, spacing of healthy and timing and spacing of pregnancies and so on. Should they not be doing this to the same extent and concentrating on other methodologies, or is that part of a more comprehensive package that we're perhaps ignoring?
Yeah, it's a great question again. And again, I'll repeat that there are so many questions I haven't been able to answer. So please do get in touch and I really would love to answer them. To try and give a very quick answer to a very complicated question, I would say there is definitely an overemphasis on family planning. It has definitely been prioritized at the expense of genuine maternal health, and it doesn't make the impact like what we think it can do. I think even a study in the Christian Journal of Global Health, which I think Dr. O'Neill might be the editor of, at least was the editor of, has a very good paper by Monique Wubenhorst on this specific topic, which of course I'm sure he's already read, about the impact of family planning on birth spacing. It maybe doesn't have as big an impact on birth spacing as we think it might. What I would say is that I'm not going to get into the conversation about contraception and the ethics of it completely. I take a more conservative view on it, a more Catholic view, even though I'm an evangelical. What I would say, though, is that there is some evidence, of course, that a bit of birth spacing can reduce morbidity and mortality. If a woman has birth literally 9 months after her last birth, that can increase her risks. On the other hand, even on a conservative or Catholic view or whatever, God clearly has given us tools for some birth spacing. I think the fact that breastfeeding, or at least exclusive breastfeeding, does cause amenorrhea and it prevents conception, I think is sort of God's indication that women are allowed to have some time between their children. And of course, Catholics generally accept natural family planning and fertility awareness methods as well. So I'm not saying birth spacing is completely wrong. It clearly does have a role, and it is, I believe, important. But I also believe that using family planning, either for birth spacing or for reducing abortions or for other reasons, has been massively overemphasized, both by Christians and non-Christians. And I think even Christians would do well to think, how can we encourage good health? How can we encourage maternal health without relying so heavily on family planning? Because it doesn't have the role that it's often claimed to have. So I hope that makes sense as a very quick answer on a very complicated question.
Thanks, Calum, not just for the presentation, which has been incredibly comprehensive, and as I say, much more on the slides than you were able to speak to directly, but also for the way you've handled the questions as well. We didn't get through all the questions. We have run out of time. Thanks very much, Calum, for your time. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along and being involved today. And it's been great to have you again. We're going to be back once more this year. We come back next week on Thursday, the 15th of December. And we have Stephen Willing speaking to us on the 10 myths of the sexual revolution, the 10 myths of the sexual revolution. So do join us then, book on the website, pass the word on, and we hope to see you soon. May God bless you, and we'll see you soon on ICMDA webinars. Thank you.